Now, as we mentioned yesterday, and as most Americans are aware of at this stage, last weekend, veteran US journalist Mike Wallace passed away at the age of 93. He was probably best known for his aggressive interviewing style and for his 28 seasons at the CBS flagship news program, which he helped to create, 60 Minutes. This was where his anchoring and interviewing styles helped the program become perhaps the most influential primetime news show in the history of US TV, especially at a time when the major networks ruled the airwaves. His work in journalism spanned more than half a century of American history, and in that time he interviewed, in his own unique style, many of the world's leaders and newsmakers, including two former Chinese leaders, Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, just as China was opening up to the rest of the world after a period of relative isolation. And perhaps this, amongst other reasons, is why here in China his death has also made headlines. But what's the reaction from China's online community? Are they discussing his legacy too? As ever, to get an idea of just what's being said, let's cross over to the newsroom now, where our researcher Esther Dung is standing by. Okay, Esther, first of all, a lot of stories on Mike Wallace's death in the mainstream press, but just how much do Chinese net users really know about the man and his journalism?
Well, I have to say, a certain number of posters actually didn't know who he is, especially when they first heard about the news. Since lots of the Chinese media coverage simply use the headline, Death of Wallace, or the legendary Wallace passes away, some posters were completely confused. For example, 国产100 on QQ.com related him to the NBA, although I don't know which Wallace in the NBA he or she meant. Saying, what? The basketball player Wallace passed away? Oh no. And some users linked him to a Chinese fast food chain selling Western-style food called CNHLS, because its Chinese name is 华来市, sounds exactly the same as the Chinese translation of Wallace. One typical example is this comment on 163.com. Isn't 华来市 a fast food restaurant? But of course, there are also some users who do know about him and express their condolences on his death. 曲高和寡 has this. He spent all his life seeking the truth. He deserves our respect. Enjoy life in heaven. And also this poster from Jiangsu who says, I've heard about Mike Wallace. He's quite famous, and he interviewed Deng Xiaoping. And this net user from Heilongjiang saw him as a possible role model for the profession in China. I watched 2 of his shows. He was humorous, smart, profound, and sharp. He was really a brilliant television journalist. To be honest, our journalists lag far behind.
Okay, Esther, since it seems not that many Chinese net users, but younger ones at least, are too familiar with Mike Wallace, why then was his death covered so widely by the Chinese media?
Well, some posters also have asked similar questions and can understand why the death of a foreign news anchor and a retired one as well is such a big topic in the Chinese media. And it is big. Actually, almost every influential web portal has published features on this. The confused include this poster, 大师姐, who asks, is it because he had interviewed 2 of our former leaders that we are paying so much attention to his death? Actually, based on the comments I've seen, I think one main reason for the coverage is Chinese reporters' professional respect for Wallace. And actually, lots of journalists or professors of journalism have published articles to commemorate him. First, we have Zhou Qing'an, who writes in the Beijing News. For many journalists and those teaching journalism, the death of Mike Wallace means the end of an era in journalism. Frankly, many Chinese audiences haven't really watched his shows. But actually, his name, Wallace, is a legend in media circles. And I feel Wallace had the style of a traditional reporter of the 60s and 70s, rather than the image of contemporary reporters. He always kept his hair back-combed and wore a decent suit, even on the battlefield. While this poster seems quite impressed by Wallace's interviewing style, commenting, Wallace's interviews often had his guests shuddering and terrified because he would suddenly hit them with an embarrassing question which floored them. And sometimes he even appeared in the interviewee's office and pushed the microphone in front of them without any warning. To be true, deep and brave, sometimes even reckless, were his news values and those 60 Minutes. And this mindset made watching 60 Minutes as attractive as watching a Hollywood film. And Zheng Dongyang, a reporter working for the East Morning Post newspaper, has this take. What made Wallace admirable is that he became famous for his questions as opposed to his opinions. He was a world-famous news anchor, but he was not an opinion leader. No matter how well-known he was, and no matter how unique his points of view were, the impression he left us was always that of a journalist.
Okay, finally, Esther, besides the accolades from those in the same profession, have you come up with anything else from net users about this?
Well, yeah. Political posters here actually make comparisons between Mike Wallace and the Chinese reporters today, and they are not very flattering in general. Many posters were impressed by the fact that Wallace kept on working as a journalist even when he was in his 80s, which is almost unimaginable in China. First, listen to Fu Yun Shi Shen Ma. I don't know much about him, but he didn't give up his journalistic career until he reached the last few years of his life. This makes me feel he was really devoted to journalism. And if we had such reporters, our society wouldn't be like it is today. And this anonymous poster on 163.com points out, China only has a small number of investigative reporters, and they are usually very young. Based on a recent survey, 3/4 of Chinese investigative reporters are under 35 years old, and 40% don't want to do investigative reports. So why can't we have top journalists like Wallace? That's because in China, journalists don't enjoy the high social status that the fourth estate has in the US, and wages and working conditions are far from ideal. But Zui Hongchen on QQ.com feels it's not all the Chinese journalists' fault either. Chinese reporters aren't less capable or professional than their American counterparts. They just don't enjoy the free and open news environment that US reporters do. Finally, Zhan Jiang, a very well-known Chinese professor of journalism, had this to say during an online interview. In China, journalists have long been considered the mouthpiece of the government rather than a real profession. And for this reason, the personal character of a journalist isn't valued. And in the US, the older the reporter, the more popular and credible they are among the public. But in China, experienced journalists always end up as officials. Few of them continue to do interviews when they reach their 40s.